My father and I used to go hunting together when we were young. He was a real mountain man, tall and big. My father taught me about survival in the wild. He explained almost everything: bears, deers, wolves. He once nearly starved to death and talked about how he survived among wolves and bears. He would tell some more exaggerated stories. Even now I remember the feeding habits of almost all animals in the wild. For years, my father had nothing in his eyes. I knew him as a man who was not afraid, but my opinion changed after the incident we experienced. That year, we were camping on a rocky hill in our favorite hunting area. I had shot a deer for the first time the year before, and I was very excited for the next day. Our plan was to get up before sunrise and head out to a plain a few kilometers to the west. The deer population in this area was quite good. That night, my father was again telling me one of the hunting stories he had experienced before I was born. In the middle of the story, we heard a shrill scream coming downstairs. He realized that I was a little scared because he smiled and said that it was a deer. When I saw my father's relaxed attitude, I said I relaxed. We heard this voice a few more times, but in the darkness of the night, the voice gradually moved away from us. That night, the sky was clear and the air was a little cool. My father saw tomorrow as a beautiful and tiring day. He said that there would be a day and that we should sleep now. Every time he was happy, my father would sing a song. I would fall asleep with his voice. I was in a deep sleep. I remember waking up shaking me, "Son, wake up, we have to go." I remember you saying, "Come on, get up." The tent was dark. My father was already dressed and ready. I fell asleep and said, "Did the sun rise?" He shook his head. "No, son, hurry up, you have to get up immediately." He said. That's when I heard it, like a cry from the rock above us. There were screams the screams were so loud that they could be heard everywhere in the darkness of the night. The same sound was always heard at 5-second intervals. The hairs on your arms and the back of my neck. It was starting to get prickly. I asked my father, "What is this, Fox?" And he said nervously, "No, we have to go quickly." I started to pack up in a hurry. The screams above us were distracting me. I had just woken up from sleep. My eyes were not fully opened. My father was acting strangely and his tone of voice was starting to scare me. I said, "Dad, tell me what's going on." He threw his bag on the floor of the tent and turned to me. "Son, I've never heard such a voice in your life. He's just been screaming for help." Then he started making irrelevant sounds. I thought maybe he was someone in need of help, but my father didn't stop. He said, "Pack your things and take your gun with you." My father was a very meticulous man about gun safety. He would never allow me to enter the tent with a loaded gun, but now he kept the gun inside the tent. I was starting to get really scared when he told me to fill it out. When we got out, the screams suddenly stopped. It was like he noticed us. I immediately looked up on the top of the rock. There were no lights visible. The rock above us was about 25 meters high and too sharp to stand on. We quickly packed up the tent in a few minutes. We packed everything and were ready to hit the road. The screams started again, but this time it was different. It was like a humming noise, like an ambulance. It was similar to the sound the siren made at the beginning. We started to go down. The sound followed us from behind. My father had put his gun in his holster. His rifle was in his hand. My father suddenly started shooting into the air and fired 2 shots. After the echo of the gun stopped, we waited in silence for a while. There was no sound. We continued to go down. After walking for about half an hour, we left the forest area and reached the meadow. The screams returned. This time it was at the edge of the forest, very dirty screams. They were throwing me. My father gave me a stop sign. I was holding my breath. He said, "This is not a bloody deer, my son." My father started walking so fast that I had difficulty keeping up with him. We entered a field. My father was standing and listening to the sounds. The screams were definitely following us. After a while, we went to the pathway in another forest, near a stream. We crossed the bridge over it and reached the place where the cars were parked. The only car around was our car. My father turned to me and told me not to stop until the car and to stay close to me. We started running. The weights on my back were making it difficult for me to run. The screams behind us started to get closer. It was pitch dark. The only thing I could see was the flashlight in my father's hand. It was the light. I was running in fear. Every scream behind me was enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up before we reached the place where we parked the car. First, my father suddenly stopped. There was no screaming for about 2 minutes. My father turned to me and said, "You will run first, all the way to the car." I started running without looking back, my father. He was coming after me. I could hear his footsteps. Just then I heard screams very close. This time it lasted for a long time, almost 10 seconds. My father shouted, "Son, run." Arab. I can't remember much until I reached the moon. I was running so fast that I kept my eyes focused on the road to avoid falling. I could feel my father's breath on my neck. At that moment, I started to cry. The screaming sound was worse than before. It seemed like whatever was making the sound was desperately trying to reach us. What did I do? The faster I ran, the closer the sound got to us. I could hear the sounds of vehicles in the distance on the highway. I saw the car ahead. At that moment, my father was running to open the door. He had started the car before I could get to it. I rushed in so fast I hit my knee on the door. As I made a sharp turn and left, we both looked at the edge of the forest. We couldn't see what happened, but despite the sound of the car, I could still hear her screams. I will never forget the last thing I heard. The further I drove away, the more my senses came back, and I realized that I was crying with feeling. My father had turned white. He stopped at a gas station a few kilometers away. I was hugging my father and crying. My father and I never told my mother or my sister what happened. It remained a secret between the two of us, and we tried to talk to her about it several times. I tried, but he always dropped the subject. It's been nearly 20 years since that night. My father and I have never been hunting since. Probably never. We will not go out. I hope you liked our story. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel for more.